Good morning, everybody. I'm not Steve Hill. I apologise. Steve was intending to do the moderation across the 2 days, but unfortunately was called away to urgent government stuff, as you have to do when you're working in Canberra and you have a meeting in Canberra. So I'm going to step in, and I'm sure I won't be as funny as Steve was, but I will try to manage the day as efficiently as he did. So I'll run you through the morning, and then I think Beck and Ben and Beryl might take over this afternoon. So I'm going to give a bit of a recap briefly on what happened this morning, and then we're going to go to our two plenary speakers. But I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd like to recognise, as we heard yesterday from Jim, that they were the first integrators of data and knowledge, and they've had an unbroken connection with land, sea, sky for tens of thousands of years. So look, thank you again. Yesterday was just a fantastic day. So we started the conversation that we wanted to start, and all of you were involved, and I really appreciate the input from all of the speakers, from all of the panel members, and from everybody that was involved in the discussion. When we set the meeting up, we didn't know how it was going to run. It's a little bit different to the way most meetings are structured, and it's always a bit nerve-wracking when you embark on a meeting that's intended to be more of a conversation than just people standing up and talking at us. So we thought it went really well. I hope you did too. Today there's more opportunity for discussion. There'll be some breakout groups and things this afternoon, and we really want to progress that agenda of getting down what you think we need to do to improve our ability to integrate data, to do integrative science, and to address some of the big challenges that came out yesterday. I think it was a really good day because we were able to hear about what excited each of the different communities, and we were able to hear that from the early career researchers who are going to be doing that work, and I think that was really unique. We were also able to hear what keeps people awake at night a little bit, and I think that's part of the conversation as well, right? What are the challenges and what are the opportunities, and what do we need to do to facilitate integrating data better, integrating science better? So my observations from yesterday were that we intended, when we designed the conference, that yesterday we'd be talking about science and we'd be talking about the science challenges, and that today we'd be talking about data. But what happened was we got straight into the data, and that's great. That shows us where we need to be focusing. It shows us what the sticking points might be around, and it shows us where the opportunity for making the biggest impact is. And I think it's something that has brought us all into the room today. So today's focus is just going to allow us to really expand on that. I'm not going to run through a summary of what everybody said. I just want to acknowledge that we will be using what you all said when we try to put some words together around the outcomes of this event, and I think it was fantastic. There were a few things that I drew from it though. The first, I think, was from Dahlia's talk right at the start, which showed us that integration of data and integrative science is really critical to addressing the existential problems, existential threats that we face in society these days. I think it showed us what's possible when we have high quality data sets, when we align them with significant computational capability, and when we throw the resources that NASA has available to them at those problems. So it really was a great way to start. And then I think Jim's talk that followed was the perfect counterpoint to that, because it placed humanity amongst the data with an Indigenous knowledge lens. And I think that was so powerful. The most telling image from Jim's talk, and probably from the whole day, was the one that he showed how the data, the observations that Indigenous people have made for generations, for thousands of years, were connected through stories, and were connected through songlines, and were connected through people. So that is data integration, and that's what we're talking about And I think we've lost sight of how to do that. We've lost the stories and the songlines, and that's what we're here to try to re-establish today. So I think there were a few things that came out for me overall. 3 things that I've written down. One was around observations, one was around skills, and one was around language. So observations, we're all observational scientists. Some of us think we don't have enough data because we have sparse data sets and we're dealing with huge problems. And that's true. But at the same time, we've got a lot of data and we don't deal with it very well and we don't make the most of it. So there's a huge opportunity for us to optimize the way we manage our data, the way we collect our data, and perhaps the way we send people out on data gathering exercises. And we should be thinking about that. With respect to skills, I think I was struck by the fact that the challenges we were talking about really were existential threats to humanity. And yet, in the next breath, we were talking about, Dietmar mentioned that geoscience is a dying science because we can't get students and we can't get support from government or from universities. The cryosphere people were talking about how hard it is to get ECRs. Andy talked about how the ECRs are the people who understand data better than anyone, and they're our future, but we all struggle to find numerate students to fill those roles. So there's a real challenge around that. And I wonder whether one of the things that a group like this could do is around advocacy. Maybe we get stuck in the weeds thinking about what are the challenges around data, but we could be advocating as well if we create a community. And then the final thing I think is around language. It came out a number of times that we use different language to describe different things, and that really is one of the blockers to the communication we need amongst ourselves to be able to integrate properly. So we don't have a common language. We use different descriptors for digital twins, for models, for forecasts, for prediction. What some of us call a model, others call data, and vice versa. We operate at different scales, both temporal and spatial, and we need to work out ways to create a language that we can share that allows us to work across all of those scales. And I think it's also worth remembering that we're talking about integration across spheres, which is great, but we don't really integrate particularly well within our own spheres or within our own subdisciplines. So there's a whole bunch of different scales to that challenge as well. So the final thing I'll say is I'll ask the question around infrastructure, because many of us here build infrastructures, that's what we do. And I think that the challenges that came out yesterday showed that we need to have big data, we need to have big computational resources, we need to have big pipelines between the data and the resources if we're going to do some of the stuff we really want to do. And I guess I'll ask the question, are we really building the right infrastructure to support integrative science in Australia? And what changes could we make to that to improve our opportunities going forwards? And the opportunity will be there for us to discuss this and anything you want to discuss today. So today, let's work out what the opportunities are, big and small, and what the barriers are, and what we can change to start to improve the way we do integrative science going forwards. Excellent. So I have the pleasure today of moderating, for want of a better word. I don't know quite what we called it that, as Steve pointed out yesterday. But we have a couple of fantastic speakers for you, and we have our international lens on this morning, and we have Simon Hodson, who's flown in direct from India Britain via India over the last couple of days, and we really appreciate him coming. So Simon is the Executive Director of CoData, and he's going to talk to us about internationally integrating data for all spheres. Thanks, Simon. There is a thing there if you need it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Tim. I think I've got about 30 minutes, plus sort of 5 questions or whatever, so I'll set that going. So thank you very much for the invitation. I'm Simon Hodson, Executive Director of CoData. Despite the awful POM accent, I live in France. So it's France. Then we had a meeting in Beijing, and then in New Delhi. And here I am. Do I click through? Okay, here we go. So I was asked to talk about internationally integrating data for all spheres. I do so very much from the experience of CODATA, which is the Committee on Data of the International Science Council, so that gives us a particular perspective, and from the World Fair project, which I will say a little bit about. I do think it's very relevant to any effort to integrate data within domains, but in particular across domains. As I said, CODATA is part of the International Science Council. That gives us a particular perspective globally. We work with our member countries around the world with various domains, and we have strong connections with international scientific unions and with the global mission of the International Science Council, which is to advance science as a global public good, and we support that with various activities in relation to data. If you're interested in knowing more about CODATA, our report and strategy is there. I express what we do in terms of these 4 priority areas. We do a lot of work on data policy, again, with a global perspective. We contribute to various international data policy activities. We do work on data science through conferences and our journal, the Data Science Journal. We've got a series of data schools which we organize with the Research Data Alliance, and we do other training activities around the world. But the core strategic activity at the moment is what we call making data work. Making data work for cross-domain grand challenges. And I think that's the area which is most relevant here, and I'll spend a little time on. So I hope I don't need to make this case very strongly to this particular meeting today. But I'll say a little bit about it. Why do we need cross-domain integration? So I think, and it sounds very much as if this was made very strongly by the speaker from NASA yesterday, the major pressing global scientific and human challenges of the 21st century, we would argue can only be addressed through a science research that works across domains and across disciplines to understand extremely complex systems, which uses an interdisciplinary approach and also a transdisciplinary approach to turn data into knowledge and then knowledge into action. And both of those dimensions, the interdisciplinary, working across domains, using data from many different sources, and the transdisciplinary approach, working directly with end users in the framing of the questions and the development of solutions, are extremely important. Almost all the Sustainable Development Goals have interdisciplinary or cross-domain dimensions, either directly in the indicators as they're framed, or in the development of any response. And I've listed 3 examples there, which I think perhaps in the interest of time I don't need to go into a great detail of. Ocean science is evidently a key example of human interaction with an Earth system. In population health, we combine, in a case study in the World Fair project, which I'll mention briefly, we combine social survey data with clinical data, with phylogenetic data to help the construction of complex queries. In disaster risk reduction, again, a key example of human interaction with Earth systems. And we might want to understand those Earth systems and regard that as a particular domain, but even there it's often cross-domain within that particular broad domain of Earth sciences. And I don't think I need to tell you that. But if we want to think about how humans then interact with those phenomena and how we mitigate, how we reduce disaster risk, then immediately we're working across domains. So I hope that case is clear, and we can move on then to talk about, well, how do we do this? I want to mention briefly our parent body, the International Science Council, has issued a recent call for action for mission science for sustainability. The argument is that we need big science-style funding for transdisciplinary and engaged science action for sustainability. And they propose a network of mission science centers and that this should be supported by a global knowledge sharing platform and implementing the FAIR and the CARE principles, as well as paying due concern to data protection. Now, I hope that call gets traction, and again, it is an example of a sense of urgency for us to have both engaged science and cross-domain science. Moving on to making data work for cross-domain challenges, and I'll talk about what CoData has been doing, and I'll say quite a lot about the World Fair project. So the IC, the International Science Council Action Plan, entrusted us with this initiative. It's written up in that action plan, and we've been kicking the tires of this for a few years, exploring what that means to support data integration, how we can do it. Data integration palpably happens, but it's often extremely manual, arduous, and labor intensive. From that exploratory work, we participated in a number of projects and then received the funding for the World Fair project, which now acts as the flagship for that activity. That's European Commission funding, and it serves to advance the Commission's mission of a Europe that's open to the world and collaborating with the world. What was really interesting about this particular funding stream, or the funding for this project, is that we were allowed to have beneficiaries around the world. And so there are two beneficiaries in Australia, Oscope and ANU for the Australian Data Archive. But we've got partners in New Zealand, in Kenya, in Brazil, 3 in the US, etc. And that was a really great opportunity to try and chart what a global initiative on data interoperability, on the I and the R of FAIR, the reusability of FAIR, and to look at data integration. Another important aspect of this approach is to engage with authoritative international entities. So the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry is a partner. You can't really talk about standardization of data in chemistry, for example, without engaging with the international union that looks after the periodic table, chemical nomenclature of various sorts, the terminologies, the color books of IUPAC. And they know that those resources need to be more fair, accessible online and usable by machines. But it's important to have that knowledge input and that authority input from IUPAC. Also engaged with the One Geochemistry Initiative, GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and the Ocean Data and Information Service. Again, entities which have global reach and which can help us in achieving achieving authority around data standards and in implementing those globally. There's more information about the World Fair project there, and I should mention that it's a partnership as well with the Research Data Alliance, and here are our partners. We see very much the project is implementing this recommendation from the Turning FAIR into Reality report. If we're going to achieve fair data, we need to encourage and enable particular research disciplines to develop what we call interoperability frameworks, to define those, to implement them, and in order to support interdisciplinary research, cross-domain research, those interoperability frameworks need to be expressed in terms of, in common ways and in terms of global standards where relevant. There's a very similar recommendation in the UNESCO recommendation for open science, which goes into a little bit more detail about what those interoperability frameworks consist in terms of common practices for data sharing, data formats, metadata standards, ontologies, terminologies, etc. The sort of things that I think we're very familiar with. And it assigns a role in particular to international scientific unions and associations, as well as those people who are creating and looking after research infrastructures. So, World Fair, what are we doing in relation to this in World Fair? Now, building on the methodology that we'd already developed in making data work, it's a very case study oriented methodology. It's really important, I think, in such approaches that you engage very closely with the particular research domains or disciplines. And so we assembled through our contacts, CoData and the Research Data Alliance, a set of 11 case studies from particular domains, and in some cases from cross-domain research areas. And there's an engagement and synthesis activity which is led by CoData that strings all that together and works across those various case studies. 11 case studies is too many. It's ridiculously ambitious, but I think it's also necessary. And I really hope that we can come out of this project with a clear statement of what needs to be done and what can be done for interoperability and implementing FAIR, and for cross-domain data and metadata integration. In order to help that, we've clustered these. There's the chemistry cluster, chemistry, nanomaterials, and geochemistry, geochemistry led by OSCOPE. There's a social science cluster, looking at social surveys, which is led by ANU, but also population health, which combines the social survey data with clinical outcome data, urban health, looking at the complexity of cities across Latin America. That's led by a project at Drexel University called Salabal, which is urban health in Latin America. Biodiversity led by GBIF, agricultural biodiversity, which is looking at pollinator data. Ocean science led by ODIS, disaster risk reduction led by Tonkin and Taylor in New Zealand with other partners, and cultural heritage. So a wide range of research areas and data types. And I think that gives us a real insight genuinely into how data works for each of those domains. Our modus operandi is really to get down and dirty, as it were, with the data. Here's the methodology. With each of those, we've asked each of those case studies to produce a set of FIPS. FIPS is an approach, a methodology developed by the GoFair initiative. It stands for Fair Implementation Profile. It's a questionnaire. It's relatively straightforward. It asks a set of questions about the FAIR principles and how you implement them. We found that extremely useful. It gives you an insight into how you can reach each of those principles, and in particular the interoperability and the reusability perspective. With each of those case studies, we then had a workshop. A workshop's a big term for it, an extended conversation so that the CoData team genuinely understands, we think, the data and the issues in those domains. And that leads, on the one hand, to recommendations for each of those case studies and on how to improve their FAIR practice. Second, FIPS, which are more aspirational. Where do you want to get to in terms of implementing the FAIR principles? And the cross-domain interoperability framework, which I'll say a little bit about shortly. Here's some, next two slides are really about the FAIR implementation profiles as a methodology. I'm going to skip over these, but there are references if you want to look at this in more detail. As I said, it's a methodology developed by the GoFair initiative. You can either do it as a spreadsheet, that's quick and easy, and because the important part's that discussion. How do you make your data and metadata fair? What can you do? What could you do to make your data and metadata fair? But there's also an online tool called the FIP Wizard, and that encodes your answers in a form of RDF called nanomaterials, which is an RDF triple plus provenance information. And that in principle, across the board, across a whole load of FIPs from a given domain, or even across domains, allows you to have this visualization, a graph. And through that, you can see which domains are using which resources, which FAIR enabling resources, and what patterns there may be within and across domains. And that, in potentially at least, could be a really useful tool for us to help understand how particular disciplines are implementing FAIR, and for us to make recommendations across those disciplines. And here's some, again, some links to further reading if you're interested in FIPS as a methodology. We did a report about our experiences working with the case studies, which is the first reference there, FIPS in World Fair, what have we learned? And very interestingly, the ocean sciences case study in World Fair used the FIPS of all the other case studies to try and identify what the connections may be in terms of interoperability and using similar standards with ocean sciences, and how the data for those various domains, whether it's the social sciences or the chemistry in oceans or the disaster risk reduction, how that might be more easily combined with data in ocean sciences. And there's some interesting insights there. What I really want to talk about, and I think is the main focus of what I have to say, is the cross-domain interoperability framework, which is emerging from World Fair. This is really the focus of our activity. So first of all, it's not a new standard, it's a framework of standard. That's an important distinction. We're not falling into that trap of saying this will be one standard to integrate all standards. It's rather a framework or a set of recommendations about existing or emerging standards that work across domains to address various parts of the FAIR principles. So we started this by identifying a set of functional requirements for data combination or data integration or whatever synonym there you prefer to use. Some people don't like data integration because they think it implies a sort of data warehousing approach rather than a federated interoperable approach. I don't think we have to choose between those. It's horses for courses. But we identified a set of functional requirements and then looked at what's going on outside the World Fair project, of course, but also in the World Fair project, and what standards are being used or are beginning to be used. So for discoverability, a lot of people are using DCAT or extended DC. Schema.org expressed increasingly, a lot of organizations are using schema.org expressed as JSON-LD. It's the relatively easy part. For sensitive data, and in order to negotiate more fine-grained access to those data, people are using the open digital rights language, the data privacy vocabulary, etc. For combining and integrating data, the new specification from the Data Documentation Initiative, CDI, cross-domain integration, comes with a set of modules for data structure, for data provenance, and the variable cascade, which help with the process and of data integration and making those processes more automatable. We need, of course, crucially, to understand and align semantics. Now, you can't get round the challenge of those definitions and the challenge of how you align or crosswalk those, but you can have good practices in the way those concepts are encoded. So using SCOS or XCOS or OWL and the new standard SSSOM for encoding the mappings across terminologies. Provenance is essential. You need to know how those data have been gathered, what their origins are, but also how they've been processed. So things like Provo, things like SDTL or the processing module in DDI, CDI, things like observations and measurements to understand those complex variables. So there's a list there already of a set of existing standards that work across domains that can help us with this data integration. Often when combining data sets, there are connectors as well. Connectors, universals, whatever. Time and place are the most obvious. We need to get the units of measurement in line, and authoritative domain recommendations. We should, where possible, use those concept lists from authorities. Now, in many respects, this is quite a simple approach. It's quite straightforward. But we don't see similar recommendations elsewhere, and I think, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think we're onto something in a set of recommendations that can be easily implemented and will significantly assist the task of combining data across domains. I've got a few slides now on standards and metadata. So we need a framework of standards. Here's the famous XKCD cartoon about the additional standard. I don't think we're falling into that trap. This is a set of recommendations about a framework of standards and a framework of existing standards and how they can work together. Tim mentioned about language. And one of the important things to say, sometimes I'm in conversations and talking about metadata, and I realize that my interlocutor understands metadata simply to be that discovery, bibliographic, and management metadata that might be the wrapper on a given file. From our perspective, it's all metadata except that individual measurement. And sometimes, so this is why there's this sort of diagram here, sort of data as a fair digital object. We have the measurement or the observation or a recording or whatever it may be in any given domain. And sometimes that measurement or recording, for example, will have a representation as well. And in certain instances, that representation is the data. But then everything around that, the identifier, the descriptive metadata, the structural metadata, the provenance and processing metadata, all this is what we need if genuinely we're going to be able to combine those data with other data. And that may seem like an obvious point, but I think it is really important to bear in mind in the challenge that we have before us. Terminologies and semantics. I've already mentioned this a little bit, but I think there's a really important role for authoritative international organizations. That can include global infrastructures. It can include those organizations which develop metadata for particular domains, globally, OGC, DDI, etc. It can also, in my view, should include international scientific unions. I'd like to point you to the IUSSP, the International Union for the Scientific Study of Populations, Demography. Their report in partnership with CODATA on how we turn terminologies, vocabularies in population research, in demography, into fair terminologies so that they can be used not just by humans referencing a PDF document, but also by machines. And there's important work there to be done by authoritative organizations. There are tools that researchers use to develop ontologies, and this happens a lot in developing our data. But if we do that without reference to authoritative terminology lists, I fear that we're making the same mistake if we're creating a code list for a data set, etc., or an ontology, and we include terms which are defined somewhere by an authoritative entity. We include our own definition of that. It's like writing an article without reference to the existing work in the domain. It's like doing a thesis without a survey of without a literature survey of what has already gone on in that domain. And I think that is should be an important part of scientific or research training, that we have not only to look at the work that's gone on, the research that's gone on in a given domain, but also the terminologies and the terminology lists, and we should reference those. Finally, on this little segment, I wanted to say something about data structures and provenance, and to reference that work that's going on in DDI, the new standard CDI. I've already described at a high level those particular modules, so I'll skip over this a little bit, but we've found that it's extremely useful. We've got case studies of it being used in Work Package 7, in World Fair and Inspire, to combine social survey data with clinical data. There's an EOS Future Science project which is combining social survey data with environmental data of various sorts, meteorological data and air pollution data, and it's also being used by the UKDA in experimental work to look at how they can provide more fine-grained access to sensitive data, essentially splitting up data sets so you can provide access to the less sensitive variables while protecting the more sensitive variables. Again, this could be an important tool for data integration and both within and across domains. Coming towards the end of my presentation, I'll talk about two recommendations that are emerging from the World Fair project. There's a lot of work on fair assessment, tools for fair assessment, the Wilkinson tool, etc. These are developed by very engaged and intelligent people. We don't want to critique that work as such, but we do feel that at times a lot of work is going into fair assessment when we still haven't really charted out where we need to go in particular domains. And so we'd argue that the fair assessment cart has been put in front of the fair implementation horse, and that really our recommendation would be to use fair implementation profiles or a similar tool, an improvement of that tool, to understand the practices that are current or needed in given domains before we start charging into fair assessment. So it's really a recommendation in terms of using fair implementation profiles. The other one is, I think, really, really important, that we need a shift from a bibliographic approach to data stewardship, where we're concerned with extended DC, with the origins of we're providing that top-level metadata, if you like, extended DC, the management metadata, and we put that in a generalist repository and expect people to download it, look at the README file, and then do all that manual work for data integration. This harks back to an article which is over 10 years old now, Parsons and the late lamented Peter Fox, Is Data Publication the Right Metaphor? And it's one of those articles that I go back to quite a lot because I think there are some very cogent arguments in there, and it's nicely written, it's an easy read, but it makes some important points about different approaches to data stewardship. And our concern is that if we're really thinking about providing data services for particular domains, if we're really thinking about combining data across domains, we need to, if you like, release the datums. We need to release those particular measurements, observations, whatever they are, from the wrapper of that file which is downloaded and then integrated. We need to provide online data services which can be federated and where people can do data integration for particular research questions on the fly. And to do that, we need considerable investment in metadata and in those terminologies and the other things that I've listed. There are some really good examples of that, notably SDMX, the SDMX Data Cube, and the work of UN Stats on the SDGs. All these international integrative initiatives that are concerned with building data pipelines to provide integrated data for particular research questions. I think we need to learn from these approaches. And so to close, my alarm is just about to go off. World Fair Next Steps. This is a project, but it's part of a larger initiative. I think we've developed a useful, easily implemented methodology. We'd like to expand that to a genuinely global program and initiative, and to create a federation of additional case studies. But in order to do that, we also need to increase the capacity of that coordinating activity, which is currently being led by CODATA. And that could be with various partners around the world. So one thing that I'd be very interested in further discussions, and whether this might come out also of this conferences as well as the other outputs, are the case studies which have emerged here, that idea of the integration across the various spheres. Could we explore this as part of an expanded World Fair Plus collaboration? And can we identify integrative activities where we can collaborate? And we could explore that through initial scoping workshops, discussions and onboarding and training from any colleagues who could assist with the coordination. And can we develop a partnership and a collaboration around integration across the spheres, but also with other domains. In terms of that, we've already started expanding the World Fair initiative. We have two new case studies supported by the International Science Council relating to emergencies, one on earthquakes, one on cascading hazards, flooding, and then cholera in Malawi. And one of the things that I've been doing over the last 10 days is discussing new partnerships with various CODATA members and partners around the world. So I'd like to end with that and a flag for International Data Week, which is coming up, where there'll be discussions about these issues in Salzburg in October. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. Simon's going to be here all day, but I would like to give you the opportunity for one quick question from the audience, if there's anything really pressing, and Donald's got his hand up first. Beck, you're going to have to run. Thank you.
Where's the hand, Donald?
Up the back.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Simon. That was really great. There's obviously an enormous energy cost for each domain in getting to the point where we're consistently using interoperable standards like DDI, etc. Do you have any vision or suggestions of what the tools may be that allow the research community as a whole to demonstrate some of the value of doing this? You know, ORCID's been transformational as a hub point for lots of value. Are there things you can see that would showcase quite quickly the benefits of going down this framework path?
Yeah, I mean, that is a tough question to answer, because some of this is itself exploratory. I mean, I think we can show through examples like ODIS that using schema.org expressed as JSON-LD is really helping them with integrating some of their descriptive metadata, their discovery metadata. And so that's a quick win. I think we can also show that encoding the terminologies consistently in OWL or SCOS or XCOS, that's a common practice which is emerging. It's increasingly widely done. This makes sense to adopt that. It gets more challenging with something like DDI-CDI, which does require a lot of coding and the addition of a lot of metadata at a fairly fine-grained level. So I think our argument with this is not for all the data that's collected everywhere, at least not at this stage until we have the tools which allow us to do this more in a more automated way. But we can show that for certain important research questions, this is really worth it because of the efficiency cost down the line. So that the EOS Future project, which is combining the social survey data with the environmental data, that allows a whole slew of research questions to be done, and it allows the organization SICT in Norway that hosts the European Social Survey to provide a research tool for researchers in that domain who want to look at what are the relationships between environmental data, environmental phenomena, in fact, and social survey questions, and to to ask research questions along those lines. So I think we can show the benefits relatively easily, and it's that opportunity cost. Would you prefer to be doing it a manual way, or would you prefer to be doing it in an automated way?
Thank you very much, Simon. I am going to draw it to a close there, but we will have a number of conversational pieces during the day, so we'll draw Simon into those conversations when we can. Okay, our next speaker is Cass Price, who works in the Indigenous Science and Engagement Program within the Office of the Chief Scientist at CSIRO, and she'll be presenting on integration and protection of Indigenous knowledges and science through Indigenous data sovereignty. Thanks, Cass.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So I'm Cass. Just see if... How do I move the slides? Sorry.
You can just use the down arrow.
Oh, the down. And do we have a pointer?
Yes,
Where's the pointer?
you can use the buttons on the pointer as well if you want to move the slides.
Cool. All right, sorry about that. So I'm Cass Price. I've got a recent addition to my name. I'm 3 weeks married today, or this week. So, but first of all, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on the beautiful country that we meet today. And I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and also extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people we have with us today and joining online. And I'd also like to acknowledge my ancestors who walk with me and provide me strength and guidance. Okay, so I'm a proud Murrawari woman. This is our country, outback Northback, and this was a pretty emotional picture. So this is one of the first times that we went out and we did a big language program out on country and to the mission, and I've got my uncle here today. And I'm the Senior Research Manager at CSIRO, and my research looks at Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance in organisational settings. Okay, so before I start, I just want to do a quick reflection. So before I moved into the research in Indigenous data sovereignty, so my earlier research, I was a climate ecologist and looked at population ecologies and everything, and this was one of the species that I worked on, which is the yola, or the mutton bird, or short-tailed shearwater, and I investigated the role of climate variability and harvest impacts on the breeding parameters. It's a cultural significant species for the Palawa people in Tasmania, and for this project I collated 70 years of data, of mark recapture data, and made a large database, which is one of the longest seabird databases in the world. But for this research, and most of my research before falling into the Indigenous data sovereignty world, I actually looked at and used a lot of Western science approaches. And what I've found now is that if I'd implemented, and when I start thinking back, if I implemented Indigenous data methodologies or Indigenous data governance processes, just how much more impact my research would have had, particularly for Palawa people. So one of the things that I would have done was actually looked at and spoken to Palawa people to see what their priorities were for managing this cultural significant species. And most of the research produced from that sits in scientific research papers, and we all need those for researchers to measure our index of how good of a researcher we are, because it's that publish or perish. But really that type of research doesn't have any impact for community or our people. So when I do research now, I actually look at what impact is this going to do for community, and what's the long-lasting benefits of my research going to have in that community. So that's a little bit about that. So first of all, I'm going to do a quick overview. So first of all, we'll talk about a little bit about Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous knowledges. I'll move on to Indigenous data sovereignty and what is Indigenous data, because we've had a lot of conversations around traditional knowledges, but traditional knowledges doesn't stop there for Indigenous data. Then I'll talk about some mechanisms and case studies, and then some key actions as researchers and organisations can do. Okay, so firstly, it's important to understand that our worldviews differ. And we need research and data that incorporates these worldviews and our Indigenous values to create outcomes that are fit for purpose and meet the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's needs and priorities. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the first Australian scientists, and we continue to grow our Indigenous knowledge systems, which have been developed for over 65,000 years, from our deep spiritual connection with country and our observing environmental processes. And from a Murrawari perspective, similar to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we are interconnected and interrelated with all things in the natural, spiritual and cosmological worlds, our kin and our Maai. Everything is alive and our land is sacred. Our spirit comes from our Maai, and through our mothers, and our spirit will return to Maai when we rejoin our ancestors to walk the songlines. Our relationship between people and the spiritual world is important, and for this reason, the more connected we are to our culture, country and community, the healthier we are and our well-being improves. And this has been proven in many Western science domains. And that's why that picture as well was quite emotional, because when you're an Aboriginal person on country, there's a lot of healing properties and everything that happen for you as a person out there. And so it was a very healing, even though like a bit emotional about it, it's very healing. So whenever you're working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, I think it's really important to realise that it's not just a plant or it's not just an animal, but it's how we're connected to our country and our people. So it's really important. Okay, so for our Indigenous knowledges and research, we have, like I was saying, a cultural responsibility to look after and care for country, and these responsibilities have not stopped with colonisation. Neither has the development of our Indigenous science and knowledge systems. And currently, as we were talking yesterday, there's an increasing desire for our Indigenous knowledge systems to be incorporated into Western sciences. Sorry, I've just got to grab a glass of water. And this, so back to the figure. So this figure is one that myself, Bayami and Sam, we pulled together. And it just demonstrates in the field of environmental science just the increase of the knowledges in the discipline. And it's, yep, sorry, I just get my breath. And it just demonstrates that exponential rise of the number of publications referring to Indigenous knowledges in the disciplines of environmental science. But it's actually important for us to, for what role we have in science is critical to ensure that our Indigenous knowledges are used appropriately and protected. And the sharing of these knowledges or Indigenous data collected need to be on the terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because there's great opportunities on one hand that we get to reconnect or connect to country, community and care for our country. However, a lot of the research is through an extractive process and often harmful to Indigenous people. And so this is a figure of some work done by David and, Dominique and Michael, and it demonstrates, did I go too far? I think I clicked, sorry. Anyway, so on one side it demonstrates the, just go back, sorry. Just trying to figure it out. So this figure demonstrates Indigenous community engagement in research and how researchers access Indigenous knowledge systems and how they engage with communities and community members who maintain those systems. So on one side you have the extractive processes, and this is commonly what research happens today. So in particular in this study, they found that 87% of all climate studies use extractive processes. And what I mean by extractive processes is that these are when outside researchers use Indigenous knowledges and systems with minimal participation or decision-making and authority from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who hold the knowledges. And it's often, and it's also research that has little benefit for communities and where research has been undertaken. And what we actually want to do is we want to move through to more of an Indigenous-led, self-determined methods. And that's on the other side. So that's what we're doing at CSIRO as well. We're looking at developing methods through there to support more Indigenous-led science. And an avenue to do this is through Indigenous data sovereignty. So, Indigenous data sovereignty is supported by the inherent rights of self-determination as described by the United Nations, and in particular this Article 18. So I'll just give you a few minutes to digest that. And Australia is a signature to UNDRIP, and organisations need to be providing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people with the opportunities to enact these rights. But to fully understand what Indigenous data sovereignty is, you have to understand what Indigenous data is. So what is Indigenous data? So Indigenous data is not just our traditional knowledges, nor is it just about the population data sets or administrative data, but it's Indigenous data that are information and knowledge in any format that is about us or impacts our lives at the collective or individual level. So this data includes data about us, so that's the resources and environment. So this is quite important for you guys as Earth scientists, so you would just digest that a little bit. So it's about information about our environment. So whether you're working at a global or local level, so if you're looking at a global scale, you'll be actually impacting, your research may impact on Indigenous communities in those global areas, so not just only in Australia. It's also data about us, so the demographic, social data, and then data from us. So this is our traditional knowledges, whether it's in archival or oral form. Okay, and so this is Indigenous data sovereignty, is a global movement, and it refers to the rights of Indigenous people to govern their ownership and application of data about Indigenous communities, people, lands and resources. And poor data practices have led to, regarding Indigenous data, has led to the assertion of these rights and interests of Indigenous people and data. And at the core of Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous decision-making across the entire life cycle, from the conceptualisation through to dissemination. And by being the decision makers, our nations can actually harness the capacity and implement strategic decisions about our own affairs and rebuild cultural structures to be self-determining. So Indigenous data governance, so this is the mechanism by which Indigenous data sovereignty is delivered. And so it's the right of Indigenous people to autonomously decide what, how and why Indigenous data are collected, how it's used and accessed. And there's two parts to this. So you've got this one, governance of data. So we've been talking a lot about this over the last few days, and it's really about those mechanisms and processes, policies and procedures about how you're going to govern your data. But what sets us aside from normal, like Western sort of ways of doing is that we actually want to embed our worldviews and values into those policies and procedures and what that might look like. And then on this other part is data for governance. So this is primarily concerned with nation building or rebuilding. So it looks like at community aspirations, needs and priorities, and what they need to do to be self-governing, but also what their aspirations are to be for self-determination. Okay, so how does all of this work? So a lot of people, we've been talking about the CARE principles. So the CARE principles are broad international principles. And then here in Australia, we actually have the Maori Wangara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective. and I'll talk a little bit about this a bit later, but at different regions you actually have a set of their own principles, depending where you are. And at an Indigenous nation level, so when you're working with community, so those community will decide how they want to embed the Indigenous data governance principles or Indigenous data sovereignty principles and what's beneficial for them. So they'll be the final decision makers at the end of the day. Okay, so this is the CARE principles. So the CARE principles were created in response to production and use of open data and big data that we've been talking about a lot, with limited Indigenous control. And the CARE principles really start shifting that data governance from consultation to a value-based relationship. So incorporating, moving into that more Indigenous leadership sort of area. And they're designed to be complementary to the FAIR principles for equitable and participation and the outcomes from the data access, use and reuse and attribution in contemporary data landscapes. So if I think back to my short-tail shearwater project, and one of the things that was actually for future use. So none of that data is for future use at the moment because it's a 70-year database that sits on my computer and there's no depositories in Australia that we can actually provide access to anybody for that. And then also here, minimising harm. There's a lot of harm from that shearwater database that could actually come out. During my PhD, my supervisors actually wanted to shut down the mutton bird industry without even thinking about what impacts that may have on community. So I had to take a slight different turn for that. So this is why these principles are important. And why do we need CARE with FAIR? So the FAIR principles are designed, as we were talking today, for that shift towards open science and open data. However, the FAIR principles don't take into consideration historical conditions associated with the collection of Indigenous data. The FAIR principles also have that potential to neglect the rights of Indigenous people and their protocols for cultural, spiritual and ecological information. So the CARE principles have been, need to be seen as a requirement with FAIR, and it needs to be developed at the same time. So, because the CARE principles are that governing structure, and so I've been in meetings lately where people have been doing a lot of work on FAIR, and when I've mentioned CARE, they're like, we don't want to be stuck in the weeds. But in fact, you can't just go back and build in those CARE principles, so it's really important at that ground zero that you actually start embedding the CARE principles. Okay, so this is in Australia. So this is the Maori Wangara Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective. And so from here in 2018, they held the first data summit in Australia, and there was over 60 delegates that came internationally. And these are the principles that decided that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people had the right to do about data. I won't go into reading out each one of these points, but one of the key questions that I get a lot is, what does it all mean? So I'll just talk through each of the principles about what they mean. So the first principle is about creating that power shift. So shifting the authority and control over all aspects of the data ecosystem and the data life cycle back to Indigenous people. So how would you go about doing that? The second point is about the right data in the right context at the right level. And to make and we need data in that format so that we can make informed decisions, and then also to be able to access the data to, meet our needs, priorities and aspirations. A lot of people ask me about this availability and access of data. It doesn't mean that we want the raw data. We actually want the data disseminated in a way that's actually useful for us to make those decisions and for community. Point 3 is about empowerment. This is about how we can set our own data agendas and to gather good data. And what we mean by good data is the priorities that the communities or Indigenous organisations have identified as that data priority. And you think that cancer is one of the highest, it's up there with heart disease for, impacting on our lives and everything. But we went into a community up into Broome, but in Broome, their priority wasn't cancer. Their priority was the social economic issues that were happening up there, and then another community as well. Their priority was actually youth suicide. So they didn't actually want to engage with us. So I think that's really important to understand as researchers, that if you think you've got a good priority, you need to fact check that with the community that you're working in, because they may have total different priorities. So that's what the empowerment's about. And then we've got data structures that are accountable to Indigenous people. So this is, how do we make organisations answerable so that they're making data structures that will actually meet our priorities? And it's also about, and then the last point is about ethical data and its benefits. So again, creating mechanisms across that data life cycle about how you can actually have ethical data, but also protective data. So Indigenous, you might have heard of Indigenous cultural intellectual property. So that sort of sits under Principle 5. And these principles are being adopted throughout Australia quite widely. So they're in the Closing of the Gap Agreement, they're in the IATSA's Code of Ethics, and then the Australian government through the National Indigenous Australians Agency have actually been working to develop a framework for the governance of Indigenous data, which is based on these principles. Okay, so just some mechanisms. So the most important one is your decision-making authority. So Uncle Jim touched on this yesterday when he had a few different diagrams of how to set up steering committees and things like that. So I've called it in this presentation Indigenous Governance Committee. So this is just about how are you going to have Indigenous decision-making throughout your project or throughout your organisation to determine Indigenous data needs. So that's one of the most important things. And I often talk to people about this. It's a good, at an organisational level, like it provides a bit of a feedback loop. So how do you get those priorities and how do you find out what those priorities are from communities so you can implement it into your business planning and your strategic plans? Because I've turned up to quite a few meetings lately with different research institutions, and we've had projects that are priorities of communities, and we simply get told that's not a priority, that's not in our strategic direction of our research institute. So if your research institution or research institutes are telling you that, then you need to rethink how you're actually setting your priorities. So this is a great, I'll just go back. I'll also quickly touch on Indigenous cultural intellectual properties and Indigenous data metadata representations today as well. So this is a great case study. This is in Syrah, it's being led by Kathy Robinson, but she's actually supporting. So her role is to support this project, and she, as it's an Indigenous-led project, it's a Healthy Country Indicators project up in Kakadu. So through this project, it's a really great, and they've taken a holistic approach. And so what they did is at the centre of that project, they established an Indigenous Governance Committee. Now that committee is responsible for all decision-making of the project. So they decided where the study site should be, and they also decided what they wanted to measure on country and how they were going to do that. It also took a holistic approach, because part of Indigenous data sovereignty as well is also that capability building of our Indigenous workforce and training and technical training. And so you can have a look as well, Healthy Country and AI program. And so there's this program at the moment where we're building up Indigenous rangers so that they can use drones and all that technical equipment so they can actually go out and measure and look after their own country. They also set up ongoing evaluations throughout that project to make sure that everything was meeting the needs and priorities of the traditional owners. And then for co-authorship, the traditional owners and elders that they were working with are actually listed on that manuscript. And so the Healthy Indicators, they produced this great dashboard, and this is about that accessibility of data. This is how the community decided they wanted the dashboard to look and feel, and so this is what was produced. And alongside the technical information, like I was saying, produced by drones and all that sort of other ecological monitoring systems that you do to manage the ecosystem, They've also got videos from the elders doing elder health assessments, which is really impactful. But a lot of the measures as well, I was saying about the Indigenous worldviews and incorporating that into the research. So some of the indicators, so if we look over the side, it's just got country, I think, is the first one. But it's not just about the health of the country. One of the indicators is about actually the abundance of bush tucker. So that's what community needed to measure for health of their country. Also about community access. So how community can access and engage with country and how I was saying how important being that connected to country is for our health and well-being. And then also about sharing Indigenous knowledges. So Indigenous knowledges wasn't that two-way thing between Western science and Indigenous knowledge sharing. This was about elders and the young people on country and going to take them out and share those stories. Right. So that was a great piece led by Kathy Robinson. So I'll just move into metadata now. So this is a big space at the moment, and it's important that we look at Indigenous metadata metadata from an Indigenous viewpoint, because there's currently no clear metadata fields that supports Indigenous people's rights in data, and there is this big global movement to develop the best practice in metadata to reflect Indigenous data, support the care principles, but also the inclusion of the traditional knowledge and biocultural notice labels. I'll talk about those a bit later as well. So one of the first things is GIDA. So they've been working with the IEEE to develop recommended practices for the province of Indigenous data. So this recommended practice is intended to facilitate the interoperability of province fields among different information platforms and databases, and to support disclosure and the use of Indigenous people's data. So I think that's quite... Oh, thanks. Also, this is... we held a symposium in May this year to develop a metadata bundle. And so we had over 60 participants at the symposium, and we're actually looking at what is a conceptualised framework to best support metadata. So we've incorporated the care principles. So the first ones are the C and the A of care, and then the bottom ones are the R and E of care. So this is still a work in progress. And then these are the traditional knowledge labels. So a lot of work has been going into these at the moment. So traditional knowledge labels. So they're designed for a data governance tool to help enable the customisation and application to be applied directly to Indigenous data. So the first one is notices, and this is a lot for institutes and researchers that hold Indigenous data. So you can pop these labels on. And then the second one is, where'd that go? Yep, and then this one is the labels. So this label is designed for community, by community, and it's to establish Indigenous cultural authority and governance over Indigenous data collections. And you can also use these to add province information and contextualise metadata about Indigenous protocols. So at the moment, this is some work that I've been doing with Megan Wong. This is a great case study. So we've been working with JARA. So there's two parts to this project. So the first part was about the kangaroo grass as a modern day crop, with a focus on crop establishment and economic development. And then me and Megan have been developing Indigenous data governance methods to support how to govern that information from the kangaroo grass project. So we can talk to you a little bit more about that today as well. And I'll just quickly touch on ICIP. So ICIP are tangible and intangible aspects of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's culture. So this can be oral performances, and a lot of the times this is information from one generation to the next. And it's also communal, so it belongs to our clans and nations. This is also supported in the United Nations Declarations of Rights of Indigenous People in Article 31. And then at CSIRO, we've been looking at ways that we actually protect and look after IC and IP. So some of the ways are through your research agreement. So when we did our research with Jajarong, we actually had to sign IC and IP rights through that research contract. And then Jim talked yesterday about the seasonal calendars. And so with a lot of the seasonal calendars, we actually put an ICIP notice on. And so these notices actually assert the ownership of the traditional owners onto their ICIP and how they want it to be used. There's some of our key topics for our policy that we've been developing. And then, so some of our key actions from researchers. So I work a lot with researchers in developing the Indigenous governance for projects. And at CSIRO at the moment as well, we've started our Indigenous research grant round. And that research grant round is really to build that cultural capability and capacity of our researchers. So at CSIRO, we can all do science, or that's why science is employed. But one of the things that perhaps falls a bit short is how do we engage with our researchers? And so these Indigenous research grants are designed to meet the priorities of Aboriginal people. And so we assess them differently that you would to a normal grant. So we ask them questions of how are you meeting the needs? And so they actually need to provide evidence from the traditional owners or the local community that they have got community buy-in for that project. They need to demonstrate how they've incorporated Indigenous governance throughout their project, what sort of Indigenous evaluation tools they're doing, and then also what's the impact and what is CSIRO leaving behind for that community to follow on from. So that's that grant program and how we assess the grants. And then these are just some sort of snapshots of what organisations can be doing. But one of the big things is identifying Indigenous data that the organisations hold and setting up that Indigenous Data Governance Committee about implementing policies and procedures of how you're going to manage that data. I won't touch on that one because we don't have time. And then I'll just quickly leave you with this quote from Maui Hodson: "Those that control the data story." So that's, yeah, thanks. Sorry.
Look, thank you so much, Cass. That was so much
Sorry,
information.
that was a lot.
No, it was just it's just fabulous, because the point was raised yesterday that often we just don't know where to start to engage, and this is something that I don't think any of us handle well. And so to see how many resources are available and the support that is out there is just incredible. I do want to give the opportunity to ask one question. We're a little over time, but I'm sure there's a question, one right down the front here straight away. Oh, well done, Beck, thank you.
Hi, Andrew Moore from CSIRO. My question is actually both to Cass and to Simon. The care principles, how far do they generalise beyond Indigenous communities to other vulnerable communities or to other communities generally?
Yeah, there has been a lot of work and they are being used in those different communities, and Stephanie Russo-Carroll works a lot and they are being used in that other domain. Yep. Did you want to?
If I can come in and add for that, we have been advised also that, and this comes out of discussions with Stephanie and colleagues, that it is important that the care principles are viewed as principles for Indigenous data and all the things that you mentioned. That doesn't mean they don't contain principles that can be widened, but it's important that we regard the care principles as for Indigenous data. I think one can identify in them principles which are important in dealing with any population, and in particular with distinct populations, or whatever word we might want to use. It would be important, and I think, in the spirit of the care principles, to develop principles for dealing with specific populations that have their own title and regard the care principles as for engaging with Indigenous populations. And that's my understanding of the preference of Stephanie and colleagues that have been involved with that on the basis of conversations with them rather than any specific statement. I don't know whether that was clear.
Well, look, thank you both, and thank you, Cass, again. That was a fantastic presentation and very, very useful for everyone. Okay, it's morning tea time. We're a little bit over time, so I'll ring the bell a minute or two late to make sure you've had time to caffeinate, and then we'll get back on track next session.